All right, welcome in everyone to our deep dive into clear thinking. This one, I gotta say, prepping for this has been really interesting. We've got a lot here. We've got a ton of research notes, a book excerpt that I thought was just fascinating, and even some listener stories that really bring it all home. I think this could be really helpful, especially when you're facing some tough decisions.
It's interesting because the sources that we're looking at, they highlight something I think we all kind of wrestle with, and that's the power of those like seemingly ordinary moments.
Yeah.
Like those little choices we make every day, they can really have this ripple effect that we don't always realize.
So it's not just the big decisions, it's those almost like in the moment, like barely even thinking about it choices.
Yeah. Precisely. Yeah. And the challenge is that we often operate on autopilot, right?
Hmm.
We rely on these kind of ingrained defaults. They're like mental shortcuts.
Hmm.
They probably served us well at some point in our evolution, but
Yeah.
but they can lead to some not so great outcomes, in the modern world.
I'm starting to see how this connects to that listener story that we got about that impulsive purchase. Like they later realized it was driven by like this deep fear of missing out, which is a default they've been battling for years, apparently.
That's a perfect example really of how these defaults can operate kind of under the surface. Like we don't even realize they're influencing us, you know. And it's not just about spending, it impacts our relationships, our careers, like everything really.
Oh yeah. I mean, we were talking about that CEO who lost his job because of that angry outburst he had. Just during an unscheduled call. That's a pretty dramatic example of these defaults in action, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it really underscores the fact that these small moments can have huge consequences. And the research identifies four key defaults that tend to trip us up the most.
Okay, let's hear them. Lay 'em on me.
All right. We've got inertia, the social default, ego,
Yeah.
and then just letting our emotions kind of run the show.
Okay, let's unpack these. You call them the big four defaults.
That's right. Yeah.
So starting with inertia, is this like the stuck in your ways kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. It's that tendency to stick with what's familiar even when it's not working anymore.
Oh, I see. I see.
Like clinging to that outdated business strategy, or staying in a relationship that's clearly run its course.
Oh, wow. Yeah. It makes me think about that listener who wants to write a novel, right? They've got this great
Yeah.
concept, but they keep getting bogged down by their inner critic.
hmm
Could that be inertia holding them back?
it very well could be, yeah. I mean, the inertia default can manifest as
Hmm.
procrastination, as fear of failure, even just a lack of motivation to step outside that comfort zone.
So how do we break free then? Is it just willpower? What do we do about that?
Willpower is definitely part of it, but the sources that we're looking at, they actually suggest that it's more about focusing on creating systems and structures that support our goals. Something we can really dive into later on for sure.
Okay, yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Let's move on to the next one. This social default. I think we've all experienced this one at some point.
Absolutely. It's all about conforming to the group, even when it goes against what we know is right. We're
Mm.
social creatures. And that desire to be accepted, I
Mhm.
mean, it's incredibly powerful.
Yeah. And it's interesting the sources bring up Benedict Arnold as an example. His betrayal, it wasn't just about money, it was about resentment, it was about needing that social recognition. I mean, wow.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that belonging, that need for belonging can sometimes override our values, you
Mm.
know, and it doesn't always have to be some grand betrayal like that. It can be
Yeah.
it can be subtle, like agreeing to a plan that you're not really comfortable with just to avoid any conflict.
That reminds me of that listener story about that meeting where they didn't speak up, even though they had this great idea,
Right, right.
because they were worried about what their colleagues would think.
That's a classic example of the social default. And it takes courage to go against the grain,
Yeah.
especially in a professional setting. But it's often in those moments of dissent that the real innovation happens, right?
So how do we learn to, I guess, like recognize and resist that social default,
Yeah.
especially when it feels like everyone else is on board with something we're not comfortable with?
That's where those strengths come in, really. Building self-awareness and cultivating the courage to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's uncomfortable. That's key to breaking free.
Okay, let's tackle the next one, ego. This one seems tricky because it often disguises itself as confidence, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's about appearances over substance,
Hmm.
seeking external validation instead of focusing on real growth.
It makes me think of like those people online, who are like boasting about their lifestyle. It's all a facade.
Right. And it's not just material things either. It can be intellectual arrogance, or that need to be right even when you're clearly not.
Well, yeah, that makes total sense. It makes me think about the listener's story about getting defensive. When a colleague gave them feedback on a project, they realized later like it was their ego getting in the way.
That's a great example of how it can hinder our growth.
Hmm.
It takes humility to acknowledge our weaknesses and a willingness to learn,
Yeah.
even when it hurts our pride.
So how do we dismantle this ego? Is it about like suppressing it?
It's not about eliminating ego, but it's about managing it effectively,
Hmm.
developing self-awareness, practicing humility, and focusing on genuine mastery rather than superficial validation. That's how
Ugh.
we keep it in check.
Okay. And finally, we have the emotion default. This one just feels, I don't know, universal. We've all had those moments where, our emotions kind of hijack our better judgment.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Letting our feelings dictate our actions.
Mm.
Think about road rage, heated arguments, or even that online shopping spree after a bad day.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the listener shared a story about sending that angry email in the heat of the moment, instant regret. Definitely sounds like the emotion default was at play there.
Oh yeah, for sure. A perfect example, how our emotions can just cloud our judgment and lead us to act in ways that are not helpful. Learning to recognize our triggers and develop some coping mechanisms to manage our reactions is key to overcoming this one.
Wow. So we've got these four powerful defaults working against us. Feels a bit daunting, doesn't it? But our sources don't just leave us hanging with these challenges, do they?
No, no, not at all. They actually offer a really, really powerful framework for cultivating inner strengths and building safeguards to help us make those clear, more intentional choices.
Okay, I'm ready to hear about that. Let's dive in.
So we've identified those pesky defaults, right? The ones that can really lead us astray. But now let's shift gears a bit and explore the antidotes, the inner strengths that really empower us to make those clear choices, the intentional choices. And in our sources, they highlight four key strengths: self-accountability, self-knowledge, self-control,
Yeah.
and then self-confidence.
It's like we're building an arsenal here, of mental tools.
Exactly.
So let's start with self-accountability. How is that different from just taking responsibility when we mess up?
It's about taking ownership, not just of our actions, but of our outcomes,
Yeah.
right? It's about recognizing that we have the power to shape our reality, even when things are tough. It's about shifting from that victim mentality to an empowered mindset.
Okay. Yeah, I see the difference.
Yeah.
The listener mentioned struggling with procrastination, like when it came to their fitness goals.
Hmm.
And so instead of blaming like their busy schedule or lack of motivation, they're starting to ask themselves, what choices am I making that are actually contributing to this?
That's a great example, yeah, of self-accountability in action.
Yeah.
It's recognizing that even though we can't always control our circumstances, we can control how we respond to them.
And I'm starting to see how self-accountability lays the foundation for the other strengths too, right? So how does self-knowledge fit into all of this?
Well, self-knowledge is about, developing that deep understanding of ourselves,
Yeah.
our strengths, our weaknesses, our values, what motivates us. It's about knowing what makes us tick.
It makes me think of that Socrates quote, "Know thyself." Seems simple, but it's really a lifelong journey, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. And the sources, they emphasize that this is not a solo endeavor. We need feedback from others, people who can offer different perspectives and help us see those blind spots.
I love the idea of like a personal board of directors
Yes.
that the sources talk about. It's like having this team of trusted advisors to offer that guidance and support.
Exactly, yeah. And it's not just about, seeking feedback when things go wrong. It's about regularly checking in with people who know us well, people who can give us those insights into our patterns.
Okay, let's talk about self-control. This one feels particularly relevant, especially to that listener who's trying to manage their screen time.
Hmm.
They mention feeling like they're constantly battling the urge to check their phone, even when they're trying to focus on work or even just being present with loved ones.
It's interesting. The sources that we're looking at, they suggest that self-control, it's not just about willpower.
Right.
It's about designing our environment to support our goals.
So instead of just relying on willpower to resist that notification,
Mm,
we can create systems that make it easier to stay focused.
exactly. Yeah. Like using website blockers, to limit access to those distracting websites during work hours. Or even something as simple as putting your phone in another room, when you're trying to have a conversation.
It's like creating friction around those behaviors, right?
Exactly.
Making them just a little bit harder to give into.
That's it. And they also talk about temptation bundling, which I think is really fascinating.
Oh, what's that?
It's about pairing something you enjoy with something you need to get done.
Yeah.
Like, listening to your favorite podcast while you're working out, or treating yourself to that coffee date, after you finish a report.
I love that.
Yeah,
It makes those less desirable tasks a little more appealing.
exactly.
So how does self-confidence round out these four strengths?
Well, self-confidence is really the belief in our ability to handle challenges,
Yeah.
right? To make sound decisions. And it's not about arrogance. It's not about thinking we're always right. It's about having that healthy trust in our own judgment.
The listener who mentioned feeling hesitant to share their writing, they fear criticism, they fear rejection. Could that be a lack of self-confidence holding them back?
It certainly could be, yeah.
Yeah.
Self-doubt, I mean, that can be a huge obstacle to really pursuing our passions.
So how do we cultivate self-confidence? Is it just about, racking up accomplishments, getting those accolades?
Achievements can help, but the sources we're diving into, they suggest it's more about focusing on the process of growth, the process of mastery.
Oh, okay.
It's about embracing challenges,
Yeah.
learning from our mistakes and recognizing that failure is it's part of the journey.
It's about celebrating those small wins along the way and
Exactly.
acknowledging how far we've come.
Yeah, exactly. Now these strengths, these are the foundation. But we also need practical tools to help us navigate those situations where our defaults are most likely to take over, right? And that's where safeguards come in. They're like mental shortcuts that help us automate good behavior. They help us make those better decisions even when we're not at our best.
Okay, that sounds amazing. Let's dive into those. What are some examples of these mental shortcuts?
Well, one really powerful safeguard is creating what they call automatic rules.
Automatic rules.
Yeah. These are basically predetermined responses for common situations. Things that help us bypass those impulsive reactions.
So it's like having a script ready,
Yeah.
for those moments when we're most likely to make a decision that we're going to regret later.
Exactly. So for example, let's say you tend to overspend when you're feeling stressed. You could create an automatic rule that says, I will never make a purchase over a certain amount without waiting 24 hours to think it over.
Ooh, that's good. It creates that pause.
Exactly. It gives you time to, engage your rational brain.
Yeah.
Another effective safeguard is creating friction. And this is about making those undesirable behaviors just a little bit harder to do.
Ooh, I like this. So our listener who's trying to reduce their screen time, they could create friction by logging out of social media, turning off those notifications, or even, I don't know, putting their phone in a drawer when they really need to focus.
Perfect examples. It's about making those tempting distractions just a little bit harder to access.
Yeah, yeah. What other safeguards can we put in place to kind of help us outsmart these defaults?
Well, they also talk about the importance of shifting perspective.
Yeah.
Stepping outside of our own limited viewpoint and considering the situation from multiple angles.
Yeah, walk a mile in someone else's shoes, right? But how do we actually apply that?
Well, one technique they suggest is to ask yourself questions like, what would my best friend advise me to do in this situation? Or, how would someone I really admire approach this problem?
I love that. So simple,
Yeah.
but so effective. It forces us to challenge our own assumptions.
Exactly. And sometimes just taking a step back and asking yourself, what's the bigger picture here can help us shift our perspective and make a more, reasoned decision.
These safeguards, they sound really helpful for those everyday choices. But what about those big life decisions, the ones that keep us up at night? Do our sources offer any guidance on navigating those more complex choices?
They absolutely do. They actually provide this step-by-step framework that can really help us make more informed, more intentional decisions, even when the stakes are high. We should definitely explore that framework.
All right, I'm ready for this decision-making framework. It sounds like we're about to get some serious mental tools here.
You got it. It's all about, taking this structured approach to those big decisions. And the first step, and it's often the most overlooked, is to really define the problem. We often want to jump right to solutions, but if we haven't identified the real issue, we're likely to waste a lot of time and energy on the wrong things.
It's like treating the symptoms instead of the underlying cause.
Exactly. One of the sources uses this great analogy. They call it the root cause principle. And they give this example of a company that's struggling with high employee turnover. And it turns out it wasn't, the salary or the benefits that were driving people away. It was a lack of clear communication and growth opportunities.
Oh, wow, yeah. So until they identified that real problem, any solution would have been just a Band-Aid, really.
Exactly. A Band-Aid on a broken bone.
It makes me think about, the listener who's been feeling stuck in their career. And instead of, immediately jumping to job hunting, this framework encourages them to take a step back and say, okay, what's the core issue here? Is it the job itself, or is it something else?
That's a great application. Now, once you've clearly defined the problem, then it's time to move on to step two, explore solutions. And this stage is all about, getting creative, generating a wide range of possibilities.
So it's not just about brainstorming a few quick ideas.
No, it's about pushing beyond the obvious and considering all those potential paths forward. And one technique they suggest is called a premortem.
A premortem? I haven't heard of that. Sounds a little ominous.
I know, right? The name might sound intimidating, but it's a really brilliant exercise. It involves, imagining that your project or decision has failed and then working backward to identify all the potential reasons why.
So it's like reverse engineering failure.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
By anticipating those potential pitfalls, you can actually develop strategies to mitigate them or even pivot to a whole different approach.
I can see how that would be so valuable, especially for someone like the listener who's considering a major career change. It forces them to think about not just the best case scenario, but all those roadblocks they might encounter. Okay, so we've defined the problem, we've explored those solutions. What's next?
All right, so the next step is evaluate options. And this stage is about, bringing in a bit of structure and objectivity to help us make the best choice. And one tool they recommend is the opportunity cost principle.
Oh, I've heard of that. Yeah. That's an economic concept, right?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
But it applies beautifully to everyday decision making. It basically reminds us that choosing one option, it always means foregoing others. So the key is to carefully consider not just, the benefits of a decision, but also what we might be giving up by choosing it.
Wow. Yeah. That's a game changer. It forces us to think about those trade-offs.
Exactly. And they also introduced this framework called the three lenses of cost.
Three lenses of cost.
Yeah, which basically encourages us to look at costs from three different perspectives: the upfront costs, the downstream costs, and the opportunity costs.
Okay, so like let's say, our listeners considering going back to school, to pursue a new career. So the upfront cost would be like tuition and fees. The downstream costs could be the lost income while they're studying, and then the opportunity costs might be those experiences they'd miss out on if they chose to stay in their current job.
That's a perfect illustration.
Yeah.
It's about looking beyond just the immediate price tag and considering the long-term implications.
I am loving this framework. Okay, so we've defined the problem, we've explored the solutions, we've evaluated our options. What's next?
All right, so now it's time to gather information, but not just any information. The sources emphasize that it's got to be high-fidelity information, or as they call it, hi-fi information.
Hi-fi, like the audio system.
Exactly, and the analogy is perfect because hi-fi information is all about, clarity and accuracy. It's about getting as close to the source as possible to minimize any distortion.
So instead of relying on like secondhand accounts or summaries, we should go straight to the primary source.
That's it. And this doesn't just apply to, data and research. It can also mean seeking out firsthand experience.
Hmm.
If the listener is considering a career change, instead of just reading about it, they could reach out to people who are actually in that field
Yeah.
and ask for their insights.
I love that. It's about getting that real world perspective.
Exactly. And in addition to hi-fi information, they also highlight the importance of seeking advice from high-ex individuals.
Nice. High expertise, I'm guessing.
That's right. It's about consulting with people who have, real deep knowledge and experience in the field that you're looking at.
So it's not just, asking anyone who's been there and done that. It's about finding those true experts.
Exactly. And they even give some tips on how to identify and engage with those experts effectively.
Oh, I'd love to hear those. I always get a little intimidated, reaching out to people that I admire.
Yeah, well, one of those important tips is to demonstrate that you've really done your homework. Experts are much more likely to be receptive to your request if they see that you're serious about solving the problem.
So show them that you value their time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And once you've gathered all that information, it's time to execute and reflect. And this stage, it's about putting your plan into action, but it's also about learning from the experience. Both the good and the bad.
I like that they emphasize the reflection part of this because it's not just about, making a decision and then moving on. It's about learning.
Absolutely. And they actually introduce a few helpful principles for this stage. One is the stop flop no principle for knowing when to act.
Stop, flop, no. I'm going to need you to break that one down for me.
Okay, so it essentially means you should stop gathering information when you're no longer getting anything new. When you first lose an opportunity or when you know something that just makes the decision obvious.
So it's like finding that sweet spot between analysis paralysis and jumping into action too soon.
That's it. And another principle they highlight is building in a margin of safety.
Oh, I've heard that in investing, but how does that apply to decision making?
It's about anticipating those potential problems,
Hmm.
and giving yourself some wiggle room. It's like having a backup plan just in case things don't go as expected.
So instead of assuming everything's going to go perfectly, we should build in like a buffer to account for those bumps in the road.
Exactly. And they also emphasize this bullets before cannonballs approach.
Bullets before cannonballs.
Yeah. It's about testing your assumptions with small, low-risk experiments, before you commit a lot of resources.
So instead of going all in on a new venture, we might start with a pilot project or a smaller scale test just to gather some data.
Exactly. It's a way to mitigate risk. And they also bring back this concept of commander's intent.
Oh yeah, we talked about that with setting clear goals, right? How does
That-
that apply to this stage of decision making?
Well, it's about communicating that overarching goal,
Yeah.
really, right? And then empowering others to make decisions that align with that vision, even when those unexpected challenges come up.
So giving people the flexibility to adapt while still staying true to the core objective.
That's it. And finally, they emphasize analyzing the outcomes of our decisions, both good and bad, to learn and improve.
So it's not just about celebrating the wins, but also dissecting the losses so we can do better next time.
Exactly. And they remind us that sometimes good decisions lead to bad outcomes,
Mm-hmm.
and vice versa. The key is to focus on the quality of the decision-making process, not just the results.
Wow. This whole framework has been so insightful. But our sources don't stop there, do they? They also connect this clear thinking with actually living a more fulfilling life.
They do. They really argue that good judgment, it's not just about making smart choices. It's about, aligning those decisions with our values,
Yeah.
with living a life that feels meaningful, right?
Yeah. Well, this has been an incredible deep dive, really. I'm so glad we could explore all of this together. It's clear that making better decisions, it's not just about, thinking smarter. It's about understanding ourselves. It's about having those right tools and strategies in place. And ultimately, it's about using our judgment to craft a life that truly reflects what matters most to us. So as you go out there and face those decisions, big and small, remember those defaults that might be lurking in the shadows. Remember the strengths that you can cultivate, and don't forget those safeguards, those tools that can help you navigate those tricky situations. And most importantly, remember that good judgment, it's a journey, It's a skill that we can develop, that we can refine. So keep learning, keep practicing, and keep striving to make those choices that lead you towards that fulfilling life that you deserve.
Well said.
And as always, we want to hear from you. What resonated with you the most from this deep dive? What are some strategies you're going to try out in your own life? Share your thoughts, share your stories, and let's keep this conversation